May 1945, Germany surrenders, and with it ends the greatest air war in history. Across the British countryside, over 750 airfields fall silent. From sprawling bomber bases to hastily built grass strips, from secret satellite fields to elaborate decoy sites designed to fool the Luftwaffe, hundreds of these aviation facilities suddenly have no purpose. Britain possesses the largest concentration of military airfields in the world, and a quiet transformation begins to determine the fate of every runway, hangar, and control tower scattered across the landscape. In early May 1945, as victory celebrations swept across Britain, the Royal Air Force and United States Army Air Forces operated a staggering network of airfields. These weren't just the famous bases like Biggin Hill or Scampton. They included temporary strips carved from farmland, emergency landing grounds hidden in forests, elaborate dummy airfields complete with fake aircraft, and satellite fields built to disperse squadrons from vulnerable main bases. By the time Japan's surrender brought the war to a complete end in August 1945, Britain's aerial infrastructure had reached its peak. Approximately 750 airfields existed in various forms across England, Scotland, and Wales. The vast majority had been constructed since 1939, built with extraordinary speed to meet the demands of Bomber Command, Fighter Command, and American strategic air forces. These sites faced uncertain futures. Some were massive concrete complexes with multiple runways, dozens of hard standings, and extensive support facilities. Others were simple grass strips with minimal infrastructure. Still others had been designed as temporary from the start, disposable airfields intended to last only as long as the emergency required. At bomber bases across Lincolnshire, Yorkshire, and East Anglia, thousands of personnel prepared for demobilization. Lancasters and B-17s that had survived the war sat on dispersal points, awaiting decisions about their fate. In Kent and Sussex, fighter stations that had defended Britain during the Blitz stood ready for peacetime conversion. Across Wales and Scotland, training fields that had prepared thousands of pilots suddenly had no students. The variety of conditions surprised government planners. Some airfields remained in pristine operational status, their runways smooth and their buildings intact. Others showed the wear of 6 years of intensive use, their concrete cracked from heavy bombers, their Nissen huts rusting, and their drainage systems failing. Many bore the scars of Luftwaffe attacks, including bomb craters, damaged hangars, and the remains of defensive positions. Unlike ships that could be sailed away, or tanks that could be driven to depots, airfields presented an immediate challenge. Each installation occupied dozens or hundreds of acres. Many had been requisitioned from farmers who wanted their land back. The infrastructure couldn't simply be abandoned. Runways, buildings, and fuel storage facilities required deliberate decisions about disposal, preservation, or conversion. The Air Ministry established protocols. All non-essential airfields were to be deactivated immediately, their equipment removed, and their future use assessed. A debate quickly emerged within government circles. Some argued that airfields should be dismantled and returned to agriculture, restoring food production. Others recognized their potential value for civil aviation, industrial development, or future military needs. What became clear in the months after victory was that the airfield network had permanently altered the British landscape, even as hundreds of sites began their transformation from military assets to something else entirely. As the war ended, the British government launched an immediate assessment of which airfields to keep and which to eliminate. Each site had consumed resources, displaced agriculture, and now represented either an asset or a burden. The decisions made in 1945 and 1946 would reshape the countryside for generations. The Air Ministry moved quickly to categorize airfields. Category A sites were essential for peacetime RAF operations and Cold War preparedness. These included strategic bomber bases, fighter stations near major cities, and facilities with exceptional infrastructure. Category B sites had potential civil or commercial value. Category C sites were marked for disposal and return to agriculture. The numbers were stark. Of the 750 airfields operating in 1945, only about 150 would remain in military hands by 1950. The rest faced closure, though closure meant vastly different things, depending on location, construction quality, and local circumstances. At bomber bases across eastern England, deactivation proceeded systematically. At stations like Metheringham and Foldingworth in Lincolnshire, engineers dismantled equipment, removed aircraft, and processed personnel out of service. The Ministry of Works assessed buildings for salvage value. Anything useful, from electrical wiring to window frames to roofing materials, was stripped for reuse in Britain's massive reconstruction effort. The concrete runways presented particular challenges. Each major bomber base featured miles of reinforced concrete, often 50 yards wide and thick enough to support 4-engine bombers. Simply breaking up this concrete and removing it was prohibitively expensive. Instead, most runways were left in place, their surfaces scarified or broken up just enough to prevent aircraft use, then covered with topsoil and returned to farming. Farmers reclaiming their land faced strange new landscapes. Fields that had grown wheat or barley before 1940 now contained concrete hardstandings where bombers had parked, Nissan huts that had housed air crews, and buried fuel tanks that leaked aviation gasoline into the soil. Some landowners welcomed the compensation payments and accepted the permanent changes. Others fought lengthy legal battles over land values and restoration costs. The decoy airfields met swift ends. These elaborate deceptions had featured dummy aircraft, fake runway lighting, and even pyrotechnics to simulate activity during German raids. Once their purpose ended, they were simply abandoned. The wooden aircraft decoys rotted, the lighting systems were salvaged, and the sites reverted to scrubland. Today, almost nothing remains of these ghost bases that once drew Luftwaffe bombs away from real targets. Emergency landing grounds faced different fates. Many had been simple grass strips, quickly constructed and lightly used. These returned to agriculture almost immediately, their only legacy being slightly flattened fields and perhaps a concrete pad where a fuel truck had parked. Others, built near towns or with decent access roads, attracted interest from local councils for housing development or light industry. The satellite airfields proved most adaptable. These smaller fields, built to disperse squadrons from vulnerable main bases, often had good infrastructure but modest footprints. Some became civil airfields, hosting flying clubs and air taxi services. Others were leased to agriculture, their hangars converted to storage for grain or machinery. A few found new military purposes as training facilities or storage depots. Competition emerged for the most valuable sites. The Ministry of Civil Aviation identified airfields suitable for commercial aviation. Locations near cities, with long runways and good rail connections, became civil airports. Former RAF stations at Bovingdon, Blackbush, and dozens of others received new identities as civilian facilities, though most would eventually close as jet-age aviation demanded even longer runways. Local authorities moved to acquire airfields for industrial estates. The combination of large flat surfaces, existing buildings, and good road access made former bomber bases attractive for factories and warehouses. Across the Midlands and North, wartime airfields transformed into manufacturing centres, their hangars housing assembly lines instead of aircraft. By 1950, the transformation was largely complete. The RAF had consolidated to fewer, better-equipped stations. Hundreds of former airfields had been returned to agriculture, converted to industrial use, or absorbed into the expanding civil aviation network. But the concrete remained, buried under fields or repurposed as farm roads. The buildings persisted, converted into homes, barns, and workshops. And in the most remote locations, some sites were simply abandoned, beginning their slow decay into the ghost airfields that haunt the British countryside today. While most airfields were dismantled or converted, several dozen entered a twilight existence that continues today. These ghost airfields, neither fully demolished nor actively used, became time capsules of wartime Britain frozen in rural landscapes. Across eastern England, the heartland of Bomber Command, dozens of abandoned stations remain visible. At sites like East Kirkby and Wickenby in Lincolnshire, concrete runways still stretch across farmland, cracked and overgrown but unmistakable from above. Perimeter tracks trace their original circuits, now used by farmers to access fields. Hard standings where Lancasters once waited sit empty except for stored farm equipment or grazing sheep. The buildings tell stories of gradual abandonment. Control towers, those iconic symbols of RAF airfields, faced various fates. Some were demolished immediately after closure, others were converted into homes, their distinctive shapes altered by extensions and modifications. At sites like Rivenhall in Essex, the control tower stands intact but derelict, its windows broken and its walls covered in graffiti, a monument to a war that ended decades before most visitors were born. Nissen huts, the curved corrugated iron structures that housed everything from aircrews to bombs, proved surprisingly durable. Farmers adapted them as storage sheds, their waterproof construction perfect for protecting machinery and feed. Small businesses used them as workshops. Even today, agricultural areas across Lincolnshire, Norfolk and Yorkshire contain Nissen huts still in daily use, their wartime origins evident in their distinctive semicircular profiles. Hangars presented unique challenges and opportunities. The massive T2 and B1 hangars built for bomber maintenance couldn't simply be demolished without enormous effort. Many were adapted for civilian use. At former bomber bases across the country, wartime hangars now shelter everything from manufacturing operations to indoor sports facilities. Some house agricultural equipment, their cavernous interiors protecting combines and tractors instead of Halifaxes and Stirlings. The most haunting remnants are the isolated structures scattered across closed airfields. Blast shelters sit half buried in fields, their concrete walls thick enough to survive decades of weather and neglect. Fuel storage facilities, built to hold thousands of gallons of aviation gasoline, were often buried and forgotten, occasionally discovered by farmers whose equipment suddenly drops into a hidden void. Guard posts, fire stations and ammunition bunkers persist in hedgerows and field corners, their purposes obscure to anyone who doesn't know the history. Some ghost airfields found unexpected preservation through government intervention. In the 1950s and 1960s, Cold War tensions led to reactivation of select sites. Former World War II bases in East Anglia became homes to American strategic bombers or British V-bomber squadrons. These stations received upgraded runways, new hangars and modern facilities, but when they too closed in later decades, they left even more substantial ruins behind. Others were consumed by development. The expansion of British cities and towns in the 1950s and 1960s incorporated former airfields into housing estates and industrial parks. At sites like Kenley in Surrey, suburban homes now cover dispersal areas and taxiways. Residents walk dogs along former perimeter tracks, mostly unaware they're following paths where airmen once cycled between briefings and their aircraft. The motorway network absorbed several airfields entirely. As Britain built its highway system in the 1960s and 1970s, some former RAF stations provided ideal routes. Sections of the M1, M6 and other motorways cut through sites that once launched bomber raids over Germany. Drivers pass over buried runway foundations without knowing they're crossing former aviation history. Google Earth has revealed the persistence of these ghost airfields to a new generation. From above, the distinctive patterns emerge clearly. 3 converging runways forming a classic Class A layout, the circular perimeter track, the dispersed hard standings arranged around the field's edges. Enthusiasts have catalogued hundreds of sites, documenting which buildings survive, which runways remain visible, and which fields show only faint traces in crop patterns and soil discoloration. Archaeological investigations at abandoned airfields continue to uncover forgotten details. Excavations have revealed buried aircraft components, discarded equipment, and the everyday detritus of wartime life. At some sites, preservation groups have stabilized remaining buildings and created museums, transforming ghost airfields into heritage sites where visitors can walk the same concrete their grandparents once hurried across. The legal status of these abandoned sites varies wildly. Some remain Ministry of Defence property, slowly decaying under official neglect. Others returned to private ownership, their wartime structures protected by historic building designations or simply too expensive to remove. A few have become nature reserves, their undisturbed concrete and grassland providing habitat for rare species that thrive in the accidental wilderness created by abandonment. Today, Britain's ghost airfields exist in a strange liminal space, too historically significant to completely erase, too expensive to fully preserve. They persist as fragments of a war that remade the landscape. Every county has them, these concrete scars that refuse to heal, these echoes of engines that haven't run in 80 years. While hundreds of airfields vanished or decayed, a select few found new life that continues today. These survivors transformed from wartime necessity to peacetime utility, their purposes evolving with Britain's changing needs. Several bomber bases successfully converted to commercial airports. Luton Airport began as RAF Luton, a fighter station that transitioned to civil aviation in the 1950s. Its wartime runways were extended and upgraded, its military buildings replaced with passenger terminals. Today, millions of travellers pass through annually, unaware they're using infrastructure that once supported Spitfire squadrons. Similar transformations occurred at East Midlands Airport, originally RAF Castle Donington, and Manchester Airport, which incorporated the former RAF Ringway. These conversions proved economically viable because the sites already possessed the essential elements: flat land, long runways, and good transport connections. The investment required to upgrade them for civil aviation was far less than building new airports from scratch. The Royal Air Force itself retained and continuously operated several World War II airfields. Bryce Norton in Oxfordshire remains Britain's largest military airfield, its wartime origins evident in the layout of older structures surrounding modern facilities. RAF Coningsby in Lincolnshire still flies Typhoon fighters from runways built for Lancasters. These stations represent unbroken continuity, their operational lifespans stretching from the Battle of Britain era into the 21st century. The United States Air Force maintained several former American airfields through the Cold War and beyond. Lakenheath, Mildenhall, and Fairford continued hosting American aircraft for decades after 1945. These bases underwent massive expansions, their original wartime construction buried under layers of Cold War and modern development. Today they remain active, their runways extended and their facilities modernized, but their fundamental locations unchanged from when B-17s and B-24s flew combat missions from the same ground. Industrial conversion proved remarkably successful for many sites. At Bruntingthorpe in Leicestershire, a former bomber training base became a vehicle testing facility. Its long runways and isolation made it perfect for high-speed automotive testing. The site also stores and occasionally flies historic aircraft, creating an unusual hybrid of commercial operation and aviation heritage. Several airfields became motorsport venues. The combination of wide concrete surfaces, existing infrastructure, and rural isolation attracted racing organizations. Former RAF stations hosted drag racing, autocross events, and vehicle storage. Elvington in Yorkshire, once home to French bomber squadrons, now houses the Yorkshire Air Museum while also serving as a storage facility and occasional racing venue. Agricultural conversion shaped the fate of most medium-sized airfields. At sites across Norfolk, Suffolk, and Cambridgeshire, farmers gradually reclaimed former RAF stations. Runways became farm tracks, allowing heavy equipment to move between fields without damaging soil. Hangars stored grain, potatoes, and machinery. Control towers, too small for homes but too large to demolish economically, became farm offices or storage spaces. Educational institutions acquired several airfields for specialized purposes. Cranwell, already the RAF college before the war, continued its training mission and expanded considerably. Civilian flying schools took over smaller fields, teaching new generations of pilots on grass strips that had served the same purpose during the war. Some universities acquired former bases for research facilities, their remote locations and existing buildings ideal for sensitive projects. Prison facilities incorporated several airfields during Britain's post-war expansion of correctional capacity. The combination of secure perimeters, existing buildings, and rural isolation made them suitable for conversion. HMP Hewell in Worcestershire occupies the former RAF Hewell. Its cell blocks, now standing where once stood barrack huts and hangars. Housing developments consumed many suburban airfields entirely. At Hendon in North London, the famous RAF station became residential streets and the RAF Museum. Croydon Airport, one of the world's first major airports and a fighter station during the Battle of Britain, disappeared under housing estates, its terminal building preserved as offices and a heritage site. The variety of conversions reflects the pragmatic British approach to wartime infrastructure. Unlike in some countries where military sites remained sacred or off-limits, Britain's land pressures and economic needs encouraged creative reuse. The result is a landscape where wartime aviation history hides in plain sight. The airport you fly from, the industrial estate where you work, the housing development where you live, or the nature reserve where you walk might all occupy ground where Spitfires, Lancasters, or fortresses once stood. These surviving sites, whether still aviation-related or completely transformed, represent the airfields that were too valuable, too well located, or too expensive to simply abandon. They are the winners of the post-war lottery, sites whose circumstances allowed them to adapt rather than decay. The story of Britain's World War II airfields after 1945 is ultimately one of rapid transformation and selective memory. In their eagerness to restore normal life and reclaim agricultural land, the government and private landowners eliminated most traces of the vast aerial infrastructure that had helped win the war. By the time historians and preservationists sought to save these sites, very few remained intact. Modern efforts to document airfields continue. Aviation archaeologists survey abandoned sites, recording what survives before further decay or development erases the last traces. Preservation groups restore control towers, maintain memorial sites, and fight to protect threatened structures. Each effort recognizes that these concrete remnants represent not just military history, but social history, the transformation of rural Britain through wartime necessity. The ghost airfields that remain visible today exist almost by accident. They survived because they were too remote to develop, too expensive to fully demolish, or simply overlooked during decades of agricultural and industrial change. They serve as reminders of how quickly even the most extensive infrastructure can become obsolete, and how landscapes bear permanent scars from temporary emergencies. If you found this video insightful, watch what happened to Britain's coastal defences after World War II next. It explores how thousands of concrete bunkers, pillboxes and gun emplacements scattered around Britain's coastline were abandoned, demolished or absorbed into the landscape in the aftermath of the war. Like this video, subscribe and hit the bell for more. Thanks for watching.